Imagine sitting in a crowded, humid marketplace in the heart of an empire you've never heard of, surrounded by people who view you as either gods or monsters, and realizing that your survival depends entirely on the strength of your steel and the loyalty of your neighbors. This is the world Bernal Diaz del Castillo lived in. He wasn't a high-ranking official or a celebrated strategist like Hernán Cortés. He was a soldier, one of many men who traded the relative stability of Cuba for the terrifying uncertainty of the unknown. Decades after the dust had settled, he sat down to write his memoirs, not just to tell a story, but to set the record straight. He felt that the official histories were making the leaders look like geniuses while erasing the blood, sweat, and sheer luck of the common soldiers who actually did the fighting. To understand the scale of what Diaz is describing, we have to start before the famous conquest of the Aztecs. It begins in 1517, with a group of about 100 men sailing from Cuba under the command of Francisco Hernández de Córdoba. They were looking for the legendary riches of the mainland, but what they found was a series of violent, confusing encounters. They encountered organized civilizations in places like Campeche that didn't take kindly to Spanish presence. There were storms that nearly sank them and skirmishes that left the survivors reeling. One of the most pivotal moments in these early years was a disastrous ambush at Potonchan. It was a brutal engagement that left over 50 men dead and their captain severely wounded. When the survivors finally limped back to Cuba, they didn't just bring stories of gold, they brought rumors of massive stone cities and vast, wealthy civilizations. These rumors acted like a fever. By 1518, another expedition was launched under Juan de Grijalva, and it confirmed everything. There was indeed a vast continent, and the sights they witnessed, including the grim reality of human sacrifice, only fueled the Spanish hunger for wealth and the drive to claim these lands for the crown. By 1519, the stakes had reached a breaking point. A massive expedition was organized, and through a web of political maneuvering and debt in Cuba, Hernán Cortés was given command. Cortés was a man of contradictions. He was heavily in debt, which made him incredibly hungry for success, but he was also a brilliant, calculating strategist. As the fleet moved toward the coast, the character of the conquest began to take shape through the actions of the men under Cortés. On the island of Cozumel, Cortés tried to win the locals over with diplomacy and gifts, attempting to build a foundation of cooperation. But his subordinate, Pedro de Alvarado, had a much more aggressive and violent approach, often resorting to looting and intimidation. This tension between diplomacy and plunder would become a recurring theme throughout the entire journey. As they moved toward the mainland, the Spaniards realized they were entering a world of immense complexity. They weren't just fighting soldiers, they were navigating a sophisticated political landscape. This is where the role of information became everything. The Spaniards had two vital tools, an interpreter named Aguila and a young woman named Dona, or Malinche. Malinche in particular became indispensable. She wasn't just a translator of words, she was a translator of cultures. She allowed Cortés to understand the political grievances of the various groups living under the shadow of the Aztec Empire. The expedition's first major victory came at Tabasco, where they faced a force of 12,000 warriors. It was a decisive clash that gave the Spanish their first real foothold on the mainland and secured the linguistic bridge provided by Malinche. From there, the march toward the heart of the empire began. Cortés began to use psychological warfare, presenting the Spaniards as a divine or unstoppable force to unnerve their enemies. But as they pushed deeper, they discovered that the Aztec Empire wasn't a single, unified monolith. Instead, it was a collection of fractured states, many of which were deeply resentful of the rule of the Aztec emperor, Moctezuma. The Spaniards found their most crucial allies among the Tlaxcalans, a people who had been long oppressed by the Aztecs and were more than willing to help the newcomers topple their masters. This alliance changed the entire nature of the conflict. It was no longer just a Spanish invasion, it was a massive indigenous uprising facilitated by Spanish steel and gunpowder. When the Spaniards finally reached the capital, Tenochtitlan, the scale of it was overwhelming. Diaz describes a city built on a lake, a marvel of engineering and organization that seemed to defy anything the Europeans had ever seen. The Aztecs met them with extreme, ceremonial hospitality. They were welcomed into the heart of the city, but this hospitality was layered with tension. Cortés attempted to assert Spanish dominance almost immediately, demanding that the Aztecs stop their practice of human sacrifice and replace their idols with the Christian cross. It was a profound cultural clash, a collision of two world views that had no common ground. While the Aztecs offered gifts and grand ceremonies, the Spaniards felt increasingly trapped. They were in the middle of a massive, densely populated city, surrounded by people who could potentially turn on them at any moment. The tension eventually snapped. Following a series of skirmishes and the mysterious, perhaps coerced, death of Moctezuma, the Spanish situation turned from uneasy guest to hunted intruder. The retreat from Tenochtitlan was one of the most desperate moments in the narrative. It was a chaotic, bloody struggle for survival as the Spaniards tried to flee the city under the cover of night, only to be caught and massacred on the causeways. They lost men, gold, and much of their cohesion. It was a moment where the conquest could have ended entirely, with the Spanish forces wiped out in the waters of the lake. But Cortés was not a man to be easily defeated, and the aftermath of the retreat showed his true capacity for ruthless consolidation. Instead of retreating to Cuba, he turned his attention to securing the lake itself. He ordered the construction of a fleet of brigantines, small, maneuverable ships, to control the waterways around Tenochtitlan and break the Aztec naval advantage. He also had to deal with internal threats, suppressing mutinies from soldiers who were more loyal to the governor of Cuba than to him. As the story reaches its conclusion, the nature of the mission has fundamentally shifted. They are no longer just explorers looking for gold. They have become the architects of a new colonial order. They have established Spanish law, secured a network of indigenous allies, and prepared for a final, massive siege to take the city for good. The expedition had transitioned from a gamble for wealth into a campaign of permanent occupation. When we look back at Diaz's account, we see much more than just a military history. We see the tension between the just war the Spanish claimed to be fighting and the reality of the destruction they were causing. Diaz himself is a fascinating lens because he is so grounded. He writes with a sense of awe about the beauty of the Aztec marketplaces and their botanical gardens, yet he remains a soldier who views their religious practices with horror. He gives us the view from the ground, the feeling of the heat, the fear of the ambush, and the sheer exhaustion of the march. His memoirs remind us that the conquest of Mexico wasn't a simple story of one group of people steamrolling another. It was a messy, complicated, and often unpredictable series of events driven by local politics, technological adaptation, and the strategic use of information. The fall of the Aztec Empire was as much a result of internal indigenous fractures and the Spanish ability to turn those fractures into weapons as it was a result of the arquebus or the horse. Ultimately, Diaz wrote this to ensure that his name and the names of his fellow soldiers weren't lost to history. He wanted us to know that while the leaders may have made the grand decisions, it was the men in the mud who actually changed the world. He leaves us with a picture of a world in the midst of a violent, irreversible transformation, a moment in time where the old empires were dying and a new colonial era was being forged in blood and gold.